But here you can see that this carburetor is extremely gross, and that could very well be the majority of our problems. Hey there folks, how you doing today? Welcome back to the channel. Please bear with the background racket. There's life happening outside these walls. We are here today to talk about this Husqvarna 455 Rancher chainsaw and to replace the factory Swedish-made carburetor system on it with a cheap one we bought off of Amazon and see if it works. I could get into the backstory of how long I've had the saw, what's been going on with it, so on and so forth, but if you're watching this video, you probably want to know how to change the carburetor on the saw, so we're going to cut right to it. I'm going to move the camera from over there to over my shoulder, and I'm going to record what I come across as I come across it. Now, there's going to be a couple of disclaimers to this. For starters, I am not a small engine mechanic. I'm not a mechanic at all, but I am the kind of guy that could watch a couple of YouTube videos, read a couple of Reddits, and a manual, and rebuild a Mazda. So there's that. Just understand that you don't have to be a professional if you have a basic concept of nuts and bolts and how they go together, and you pay attention to things when you take them apart and when you put them back together. I'm going to speed up the video in areas where I deem it appropriate, but I am going to set a little counter down in the corner so that you can see an overall time lapse of how long this is going to take me. I will put together a list of the tools needed to make it happen. I don't have it yet because I haven't torn into it yet, but once I have it figured out what all is necessary, I'll put together a little list and I'll superimpose it into the beginning of this video. Inside the box, we have a pair of gaskets. We have a replacement fuel pickup line. We have a piece of replacement line for the primer bulbs. We have a replacement primer bulb. We have a replacement spark plug. A replacement fuel filter. And last but not least, our replacement carburetor. Before we discard our old one or start taking parts off of it, let's make sure that the new one matches what we had for the old one. Here's our new one. Here is our old one. And for all intents and purposes, they appear to be the same. Without further delay, let's get into the rebuild on this saw. Okay, folks, so my apologies. I actually filmed this video twice. I filmed it yesterday, and the overall quality was so incredibly bad when I was going through the editing process that I decided to start over from scratch. So this isn't the first time through it, but it will be to your benefit, so we'll just keep rolling with it. I will film it now, I will go back through later, and if there's something in particular that you can't see well in the video, I will make an effort to put a still shot at final editing. Also, I'll point out here a couple of things. One, the bar and chain have been removed from this saw. That is not necessary to do this. I took them off to clean it, and I found it was easier to leave them off because I can move the saw around on the workbench without knocking things off with the bar. For starters, you will need a flat tip screwdriver. The one that comes with the saw works well. You have 1, 2, 3 screws that need to be removed in order to remove the top cover. We'll pull that off now. You'll see there it's a little dirty inside. I did use an air hose to blow off the excess, but I didn't do anything else in the way of cleaning that. I did, however, do a significantly better job at cleaning out some of the internals of the saw. And as I say that, I see stuff on the spark plug wire left over from when I put that on. So I probably should have cleaned that out a little better. All right, so before you go any further, we need to remove the air filter. That can be done with a flat tip screwdriver. Just put it here between the plastic and the metal, pop it loose, give it a wiggle, and it'll come right off. We'll set that to the side. I recommend one of these magnetic dishes to put your metal parts in. You'll see here that I have some of the old parts off of the saw already in there. All right, real quick, first things first, let's go ahead and remove this wire bail so it doesn't break or get bent up. Our next step would be to remove the ground wire, which attaches into the red stop switch right there. If you just lightly pull on it, it'll come free. And then, using your flat tip screwdriver, come over here where the yellow rubber covered spade connector is, and give it a little whack, and it'll come off of there. We can now move this back out of our way. Just going to put it on the other side of that primer bulb assembly. Now that we have that removed, let's remove our upper air intake hoses. I'm just going to use a flat bladed screwdriver to nudge them back. Be careful, they are rubber. They will move back with minimal effort. All right, once you have those back, you need to remove this linkage here. I've already disconnected it, but it's kind of a game of pulling this down and wiggling it with a pair of pliers to get it to come loose. Once you have it loose, you can pull it free of the grip of the saw. Set it to the side. We'll remove this little rubber, I guess it's to keep sawdust and stuff out of the carburetor. It just kind of goes into that hole to shield where that throttle connector goes through. Now that we have all that disconnected, we need to loosen 2 screws. At this point in time, I'll point it out to you. These 2 upper screws on the intake, don't mess with those right now. Leave those intact. You'll appreciate it later. But we need to take the 2 loose that are down below. Now these are T25 Torx heads, and you'll need kind of a long handle to take them loose. I've actually already got these backed out about as far as they need to come. It is really difficult to remove those with the carburetor installed on the engine. You kind of just need to back them out and then remove the unit, and then you can take it apart, which is what we're going to do right now. But before we go that far, let's take this lower primer bulb hose loose off of our primer bulb. We will leave it attached to the carburetor for the time being. There's another fuel hose right down here that we'll remove as soon as we get the carburetor free. Having the screws backed out, take a flat bladed screwdriver, and there's a rubber isolator on either side here, kind of a motor mount, if you will, kind of apparatus that holds the body of the carburetor in place. We're just going to pry that back on one side, get it loose, and then we can pry the other side loose. Now we can pull the carburetor out. You will notice, as I mentioned before, the fuel line here at the bottom. I'll point that out to you. Where the carburetor is connected to the fuel pickup in the tank, we're going to go ahead and pull that loose at this point. If you purchased an entire kit which came with replacement hoses, you would go ahead and pull your old hose and fuel filter free and then lay them out and measure them to the new ones. We have already done that. The one very important thing I will point out to you here is there's a rubber grommet that hose goes through, and that's what keeps the tank from leaking fuel when the saw is tossed around. Try not to remove that grommet from the body of the saw. If it comes out, put it back in place, lubricate your fuel line, and push it through. Don't try to put the grommet on the fuel line and then get it through the hole. It really doesn't work well like that. So we have already replaced this fuel line and the fuel filter, so we're going to leave it alone. So there we go. Okay, that worked better. I've got our fuel line installed now. through the grommet, and we'll go ahead and we'll put the fuel filter back on and push it back into the tank opening. We also replaced this yellow pickup line, which goes to the rear grommet, and that is what primes the carburetor with the little primer bulb, which we have already replaced. Here's the old one here. Now, I know I said I was going to do this in real time, but what I found was everything was real dirty. I was having to stick my head in the way to see what I was doing, and as a result, I got a lot of gunk down in there, and you couldn't see what I was doing in some of the portions of the video. So I'm trying to do it like this so that you can see everything. So now we have our new fuel line installed. Let's replace the primer bulb pickup line that goes down into the tank. And we'll be more careful not to pull the grommet out on this one. For reference, this is the line from the old primer bulb. And you can see here it was just over an inch, about 1.25 inches of line was sticking down through that grommet that I showed you earlier into the tank to pick up fuel. Once you have all these fuel lines replaced, there is another line here that goes to the backside of the carburetor body. If you pop that loose, it appears to be in good repair, and what I did rather than remove it was I just sprayed a little carburetor cleaner down through it, and then I sprayed some carburetor cleaner through this hole, which sprayed out the little inlet that it's attached to. And it appeared to be clear and in good shape, so I just left it alone. If you were to replace this hose, you would have to further disassemble the saw, and I don't see that as being necessary for a carburetor replacement, so we're going to leave it alone for now. You'll notice here that this rubber gasket surface on the front of the intake here appears to be in pretty good shape. I'm going to leave it alone. The kit did not come with a replacement one. It did come with a felt gasket that fell apart almost immediately. The gasket was of extremely poor quality, so I figured my chances were better with leaving the factory rubber gasket in place. So once you have your carburetor removed from the saw, it's going to be dirty and nasty. I've already cleaned this one up to make it a little easier to see what I'm doing. Let me go over a couple of things that you're going to need to know about. For starters, if you're not completely familiar with carburetors, these two screws right here are the fuel-air mixture screws. They need to be set and then tuned prior to installation. This particular carburetor was purchased on Amazon, and it did not have a slot in the top of either of these screws, so you could not take a flat-bladed screwdriver and turn them. Rather, it was made for a carburetor tuning wrench that not everybody has laying around. You can buy one of those or a set of those on Amazon for about $5 or $10, but I chose just to take my Dremel tool and notch the head of those screws so that I could adjust them with a flat-bladed screwdriver. Do what you will with that. There are a few parts to the factory carburetor that you're replacing that you will need to harvest and relocate onto your new carburetor. Let's go over those now. For starters is the body of the intake, these plastic parts. Remember, we loosened these two screws to remove the unit from the saw. You need to take them all the way out. In addition, you need to remove the two that are on the top. Then you can separate this portion from the metal body of the carburetor. I've already got this one put together, so I'm just going to show you on the old one what that looks like. This is what is behind that plastic part. When you remove these two upper screws, the rear air intake will also come loose. When you put it back on, just remember to have the outlets on the upper portion of it pointed up and out. If you put them on upside down, you won't be able to hook up your lines properly when you go to put it back together. This piece, along with this piece on the saw, have gaskets that I determined were suitable for reuse. I would imagine that if yours were in bad repair, you would want to replace them with either the ones that came with the kit or an aftermarket gasket. In this case, we will not be doing that. When you remove the rear plastic portion of your carburetor, you're going to have to disconnect this choke linkage right here, this blue plastic thing. I'm going to show you on the old carburetor how that fastens on. If you look here on the old carburetor, you'll see that it pushes through that big hole and snaps into place. In order to do that, try to show you here, there are two little plastic tabs on the blue plastic that you need to compress with a pair of pliers and work it through the hole. You want to be real careful with that, because if you break the blue plastic, you're going to have to replace it. What I did, and what I would recommend to you if you're concerned about breaking it, would be to remove that Phillips head screw right below it, take the whole linkage off of the old carburetor, and then you can see and get to the backside of that blue piece of plastic a little easier, and you won't have the issues with working blind and in an awkward position. And so you can see how that linkage works. When you pull the blue plastic, it rotates that assembly around, which rotates your butterfly inside the carburetor for cold weather startup. The rest of the linkage that you see here on the air intake side of things came pre-assembled on the new carburetor, so we're not going to be reusing any of that off of the old one with this model. You may purchase one that requires that you reuse that little metal bar. In order to get it off of there, you have to turn it back like that, pull it down, and you can take it out. But we're going to leave it in place for now. Changing the primer bulb was easy. I'm going to reuse the video that I made yesterday to show you how to do that. Basically, you push these tabs in, push it out of the way, snap a new one in, and replace the lines. Remove the old primer bulb and replace it with a new one. And hook this hose to the top longer. Now I'm going to show you how to put all this back together. For starters, make sure these upper screws are nice and tight, and go ahead and install the lower screws to where they're just inside the face of the carburetor. Now that we have them like that, I'm going to reach down here and I'm going to pull the fuel line up through the grommet a little bit to give me some room to work with, so that I can reconnect it to the bottom of my carburetor. Now to get it back down into place, I'm going to pull on the other end of the line, which is sticking out through the gas port, while I coax it down. If it doesn't want to go easily, you can lightly lubricate it, which will make it a little easier. Just be careful not to get contaminants into the tank. Give it a little. That'll make it slide in better. Once you have most of the excess taken up out of that, I'm going to go ahead and reconnect my air intake hoses at this point, because it's easier than trying to do it when the carburetor is already installed. Go ahead and slide them on over to where the little band on it is behind the bell on the plastic, and that is approximately where it was at when we started this process, and should keep everything secure. Now that we have those reinstalled, comes the task of working it back down into place without pulling our fuel line loose. You have a little rubber boot, I'll show you here, right there, that slides over your carburetor tuning screws, and then for your low idle and your high limit, you use those two holes, which is actually one hole, to access those two screws while tuning the saw when it's in operation. Once you get that slid into place, you're going to work the body of the carburetor back down into the saw, and you're going to reattach these rubber grommets as you get it down there. Once you get all those reconnected and your fuel line is safely secured and not kinked, be sure you take out the slack so it doesn't get kinked. You're going to want to wiggle the body of it around until, and it's kind of hard to see, I don't know if I can show you on camera, but you're going to want to look down in there and make sure that the face of your carburetor is flush with the face of the rear portion of the intake. Once you get to that point, we're going to take our T25 Torx and we're going to start working on reinstalling those screws, which will draw the two pieces together. The rear portion of the intake is somewhat flexible as it's got a rubber boot on the back side of it, which helps to line everything up. Once you get your carburetor secured with the two screws down there, which I found out is easier if you do it before you put it inside this little rubber isolator here, but it is doable without. Go ahead and retrieve your ground wire, which I had tucked behind here. I just pulled it out with a pair of needle nose pliers. You're going to attach it on that spade connector right there. Once you get it started, use a pair of needle nose pliers to work it up onto the connector. Then you'll take this spade connector, which has been strategically bent into position to fit inside this little groove here, and push it back into place. Now let's go ahead and hook up our primer bulb hose to the bottom outlet on our primer bulb. There we go. Okay, now comes time to reinstall the linkage for the throttle. That's what pushes out here. This white plastic portion goes inside the grip. There's a little square notch or rectangular notch that it goes back into. And the hooked portion goes into the hole on the bottom of this throttle plate here. I have seen it done where you put this portion into the grip and then contort this end around to get it lined up into the hole. I found that to be somewhat difficult. The way I'm going to do it, while not easy, seemed to be a little easier, and that is to manipulate the linkage into the hole with this end loose. Don't forget to put your little rubber gasket there, which goes down into this slot. Once you have that installed, work your linkage forward, and then you can kind of twist and coax the rear portion of this down into the hole in the grip. There we go. I'm not sure which way is better. I know that works, and for me it was easier than trying to install it into the grip and then push the linkage twist the linkage around into the plate. So now we'll double check and make sure that's working as it should, which it appears to be. Put your rubber isolator back down inside there. Moving on, we will put our bail for our air filter back into place. And we'll reinstall our air filter at this time. Now, I didn't go over removal and reinstallation of the spark plug. If you can't figure out the spark plug, you probably shouldn't be messing with this part of it. So let's get the top cover back on, and we'll take it out and test it and see if it works. All right, so I ask for your patience while we do this. This has been a learning experience. I have not so much as even primed the primer bulb on this yet. So I'm going to let you see it happen in real time so we can see what happens now that we've replaced the carburetor. I have filled it full of fuel, which I figure y'all didn't need to see that part of it. But once I get the primer bulb full of fuel, I'll give it 5 presses. I will set the brake, pull the choke, decompress the cylinder compression, although we shouldn't need to do that. And so now I'm going to pull the handle a total of 5 times, which is what the instructions say to do.
A few moments later.
All right, we had a technical difficulty. Some idiot left the air fuel mixture screws turned all the way in on the carburetor, so I've got those adjusted now, and we're going to see if it makes a difference. All right, so it took me a minute to get it right, but I think we're there now. So